Reid Calloway, founder of Callaway North Timber, and the man who had turned a dying lumber operation into one of the most quietly powerful private companies in Western Canada, had not wept in 11 years. Not at the reading of his wife's will, which had been brief and generous and had broken every person in the room except him. Not at his son's first hockey game when the boy had scored twice and turned to the stands with his arms out, looking for a face that wasn't there. Not at the small brass marker they had placed at the edge of the Okanagan property, beneath the poplar trees Maeve had planted the summer before she got sick. 11 years of perfect, measured stillness. And then, on a grey Wednesday in March, a woman named Josephine Holt arrived at the Callaway Ranch outside Kelowna to interview for the position of companion and tutor to his son. And she did something no one in 11 years had thought to do. She told him the truth. The position had been advertised twice. The first time, no one suitable had applied. The second time, his housekeeper, Mrs. Abernethy, had quietly revised the wording from distinguished household with high expectations to family home seeking steady, warm presence, and 4 candidates had written back. Mrs. Abernethy had read all 4 letters at the kitchen table with her reading glasses on and her second cup of tea going cold, and had said, without looking up, that there was one worth interviewing. Josephine Holt was 31 years old. She had worked for 7 years as a resource teacher at a small school in Penticton before the school district had reorganized, as school districts do, and the position had been absorbed into a spreadsheet. She had a degree from UBC and a second one she hadn't finished from a community college in Vernon in horticulture, which she had started the autumn after her mother's stroke and had never gone back to complete. She had no nanny agency. She had a letter from the principal of the Penticton school that said, in its second paragraph, "There is a kind of attention some teachers give that cannot be trained, and Miss Holt has it in full measure." She drove up from town in a blue Civic, with a cracked windshield on the passenger side that looked like it had been cracked for some time and had been made peace with. She wore a green wool coat and sensible boots, and carried a canvas bag that had a small rip along the bottom seam, repaired with a strip of iron-on denim in a slightly different shade of green. She was not, in any conventional sense, prepared for the scale of the Callaway property. The long gravel drive, the timber-framed main house, the Okanagan hills folding behind it like a held breath. She did not appear to be intimidated. She appeared to be looking at the poplar trees. Mrs. Abernethy met her at the door, took her coat, and led her to the back study where Reid Calloway was waiting. He did not rise. He was on a phone call. He raised one hand and gestured to the chair across the desk, the way a man gestures to a chair in a waiting room, not an interview. The chair was plain wood, functional, and had no particular story. He had removed all the chairs with particular stories. Josephine sat. She set the canvas bag down at her feet. She waited. She did not look at her phone. She looked at the window which looked out over the lower pasture, and at the edge of the tree line where the poplars were beginning, faintly, to bud. Reid ended the call. He looked at her. She was still looking at the trees. Miss Holt. She turned. "Yes, you were looking at the poplars." She did not apologize for it. "They're about 2 weeks from leafing out." She paused. "Whoever planted them did it well. They're in a good spot for the elevation." He put down his pen. He had not expected this. He had expected the folder of credentials to come out of the canvas bag. He had expected the practiced settling of expression that meant a person was deciding how best to perform calm. "My wife planted them," he said. His voice was the voice of a man who said that sentence approximately once a year, in a controlled setting, and had learned to say it without anything leaking through. "She planted them well," Josephine said, simply. Without adjustment, the interview proceeded. It was not, by the standards of the interviews that had come before, notable. He asked the expected questions, and she gave answers that were honest and in some cases shorter than he had been trained to expect. When he asked why she wanted the position, she said, "I need the work and I'm good with children who have gone quiet." Then she said, "He's gone quiet, hasn't he? Your son." It was not a question. It was the kind of sentence that landed with the particular weight of a thing said by someone who has learned to read a room before they speak. "His name is Owen," Reid said after a moment. "Does he know I'm coming? He knows someone is coming." Josephine looked at the window again. The poplars, the long pasture, the specific quality of Okanagan afternoon light that had no equivalent anywhere else she had been. "How long has he been quiet?" Reid looked at her for a long time, long enough that Josephine did not fill the silence. "Since his mother died," he said. "How old was he?" 3. She nodded slowly. "So he doesn't remember the sound of her voice. He only knows the quiet." It was the truest sentence anyone had said in that room in 11 years. Reid Calloway, who had built his father's modest timber operation into a private holding with interests across 3 provinces, who had negotiated leases and bought out partners and sat at tables where very large amounts were decided by very few words, opened his mouth and had nothing to say. "You're hired," he said. Eventually, Josephine looked back at him. She looked, he thought, unsurprised. She looked like a woman who had learned not to be surprised by the obvious. The position came with a cottage at the north end of the property. The cottage had a wood stove and a deep porch, and a view of the lower orchard. The previous companion, a woman named Mrs. Sorby who had lasted 14 months, had kept the blinds on the porch side drawn. Josephine opened them on the first morning and left them open. Owen came to find her on the third day. He was 11 years old. He had his father's build, already, the width through the shoulders, the quality of stillness. He had his mother's eyes, which Reid knew from photographs because he no longer kept any of them in the main house, having moved them to a box in the cedar closet at the end of the hall that he had not opened in 6 years. Owen stood at the end of the cottage porch with his hands in his jacket pockets and said nothing. Josephine was repairing the screen on the side window with a piece of mesh she'd found in the shed and a staple gun. She did not stop. "There's tea if you want it," she said. "I'm going to be at this for a while." He came up the steps. He sat on the porch railing, not in the chair. The way children sit when they are not yet decided. He didn't speak. She didn't push. She worked the staple gun in steady intervals. The afternoon moved. The lower orchard caught the long light. "Can I do the other side?" Owen said eventually. She handed him the staple gun without comment. He did the other side. He was not bad at it. When he was done, he looked at the repaired screen with the particular satisfaction of a child who has been given a real task and completed it. "My mum liked fixing things," he said. "That's what my dad told me." Josephine set down the spare mesh roll. "What did she like to fix?" He thought about it. The tractor once, and the radio in the kitchen. And people, he said. That's what Mrs. Abernethy says, that she was the kind of person who fixed people. Mrs. Abernethy sounds like she knew her well. She cried at Christmas still, Owen said, in a voice that was not sad, exactly. It was the voice of a child reporting weather. She cries at Christmas and then she makes shortbread and pretends she wasn't. Josephine nodded. That's its own kind of fixing. Owen looked at her. He had, for his age, a very steady look. He didn't squint or glance away. He looked the way children look before they have learned that looking directly at someone can be considered an act of aggression. "Are you going to leave?" he said, like the others. "I don't know," Josephine said. "That depends a bit on your father and a bit on you and a bit on how I do." He nodded. It was, apparently, the correct answer. He jumped down from the railing. He walked back along the path toward the main house with his hands still in his pockets. He came back the next day and the day after. By the end of the first week, he was doing homework at the kitchen table in the cottage, while Josephine read. By the end of the second week, he was telling her, in his careful, measured way, about the things his mother had left behind, that he knew about. The poplars, the shortbread recipe Mrs. Abernethy kept in a tin on the high shelf, the three-legged cat named Biscuit, who still slept on the back step, and who had been, according to family record, his mother's particular project. Reid Calloway noticed the change in his son the way men notice things they have been afraid to look for. Slowly, and from a distance, and with a feeling he couldn't immediately name. He began, in the mornings, to find reasons to be at the edge of the property nearer the cottage. He told himself it was the fence along the north pasture, which needed attention. Mrs. Abernethy, who had been with the Calloway household for 22 years, and who had learned in that time to say nothing and know everything, said nothing. It was on a Thursday in April that he heard them. He had come around the north side of the orchard on the ATV, ostensibly checking the irrigation line, and had cut the engine near the old wooden fence that separated the orchard from the cottage garden. He had not meant to stop. He had stopped. Owen was in the garden with Josephine. They had, apparently, started a kitchen garden in the bed along the south-facing wall that had been bare since Maeve had been well enough to use it. Owen was holding a packet of seed and reading the instructions on the back with the careful precision of a child who has been told instructions matter. "These have to go in a centimetre down," he said. "About that," Josephine said. She was on her knees in the bed, making shallow rows with her fingers, the way her grandmother taught her, with the pads of the fingers, not the tips, so you feel the temperature of the soil before you commit the seed. "My mum had a garden here," Owen said. He said it the way he said most things about his mother. Matter of fact. "A report," Josephine said. "You can tell by how the soil is still good here. Someone kept this bed properly for a long time." Owen was quiet. He put the seed packet down. He looked at the south-facing wall, at the stone and the old nail, where something had once been trained up on wire. "She used to grow tomatoes there," he said. "Mrs. Abernethy told me. She said they were the best tomatoes she ever ate." He paused. I've never grown a tomato. Josephine looked up at him. We'll start one. What if I kill it? Then we'll start another one. What if I kill that one too? Then we'll have learned 2 things instead of 1. Owen sat down in the dirt beside her, in his good jeans, without apparent concern for the good jeans. He took a small trowel from the box of garden tools they had found in the shed and began to work a row beside hers. Reid Calloway sat on his ATV on the other side of the fence for a long moment. He did not know what he was feeling. He had not known what he was feeling, precisely, for 11 years, because he had spent 11 years making sure feeling things was something that happened in designated, manageable increments. Grief counselor on the first Thursday of every month for 8 years. Exercise at 5 in the morning. Work until 7. Dinner with Owen at 7:30, with conversation that was predictable and warm and went no deeper than the surface of the well. He started the ATV. He drove back to the main house along the fence line. He did not tell Mrs. Abernethy what he had seen, but that night at dinner he asked Owen how the garden was coming. Owen looked up. We're starting tomatoes, he said. Along the south wall. Like Mum had. Reid set down his fork. He looked at his son, 11 years old, Maeve's eyes, his own chin. A small line of soil still along the edge of one thumbnail. Good, Reid said. That's good, Owen. It was the first time in 11 years he had said his wife's name at the dinner table without it costing him something he had to quietly recollect afterward. The problem arrived, as problems in these situations tend to in the form of a woman with excellent logistics. Her name was Marlena Stowe. She was 39. She had been for the past 4 years positioned beside Reid Calloway at industry events, with the practiced ease of someone who had been told, and believed, that proximity was the same thing as inevitability. She was polished and organized, and she liked Owen in the distant, cordial way of someone who had decided children were a variable to be managed rather than a person to be known. She arrived at the ranch on a Saturday in late April with a weekend bag and a bottle of wine from a Naramata vineyard and a smile that carried no questions. She had been invited, or had assumed an invitation. These were, in Marlena's experience, often the same thing. She arrived to find Owen in the cottage garden with Josephine, the 2 of them staking the first of the tomato seedlings with small bamboo canes. She arrived to find Reid standing at the garden fence watching them, his hands in his jacket pockets, not watching with the detached proprietary air of an employer, watching the way people watch things they hadn't expected to need. Marlena took in the open cottage windows, the 3-legged cat on the step, the trowels in a row along the porch. The particular quality of the scene, which was untidy and warm and entirely unlike anything the Calloway property had looked like in the 4 years she had been periodically visiting it. She took in specifically the way Josephine Holt laughed when one of the bamboo stakes fell over easily, without self-consciousness. The way a person laughs who has not been told their laugh requires management. She took in Reid's expression when he heard it. That evening in the main house, over the Naramata wine, she raised the matter with the practiced indirection of someone who had learned to move pieces without appearing to move them. She's very young, Marlena said. The new one. She's 31, Reid said, and very casual with Owen. Owen seems well. Marlena set down her glass. Reid, you're not thinking clearly. He looked at her. She is an employee, Marlena said. She is a woman who needed a job. She is living in your cottage and planting your wife's garden and telling your son things about his mother that are, he said it quietly. That's enough. There are photographs, she said, with less certainty than she'd intended, of her in the village with Owen. People talk. You're bored, he said. I know what this is, and I know what you're hoping I'll do, and I'm going to ask you to drive back to town tonight. She went very still. I'm sorry, he said. That's not kindly said, and I mean it better than I've said it. She left. She left well, which was the best thing Reid would say of her afterward in his private accounting. She left without theatre. She took the wine. What he did not know, what no one had thought to tell him, was that Josephine had come to the main house that evening to return a copy of Owen's school schedule she'd borrowed, and had stood for 2 minutes in the hallway outside the sitting room while the conversation was still going on. She had heard her own name. She had heard the word employee and the word casual and the silence that followed the word wife. She had set the schedule on the hall table. She had walked back to the cottage. She had sat at the kitchen table with her coat still on for a long time. The next morning she was in the garden at 7. Owen came out at past. She handed him the watering can without comment. They watered the tomatoes. She did not, in the days that followed, leave. But she was quieter. She was careful in the way a person is careful when they have understood something and are deciding what to do with it. She was still present with Owen. She was, with Reid, slightly more formal. She called him Mr. Calloway again, having moved over the past weeks to calling him Reid in the way people move to first names when the formality has stopped serving any function. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He had built his company, in no small part, by noticing things before the room did. He did not address it. He told himself it was appropriate. He told himself professional boundaries existed for clear reasons. He sat in his study in the evenings and read reports until midnight, and did not go to the window that faced the cottage, where the light stayed on until 9 and then went dark. It was Mrs. Abernethy who, on the Thursday of the third week, set a cup of tea in front of him at the kitchen table with a firmness that was a form of speech. She had worked for the Calloway household for 22 years. She had ironed shirts for a man who wore grief like a business suit. She was 68 years old, and she had decided, sometime in early April, that she had been patient long enough. She did not sit down. She said, "Owen asked me this morning whether Miss Holt was going to stay." Reid looked up. "I told him I didn't know." She paused. "I thought you should know," he asked. He looked at his tea. "What did he say exactly?" He said she doesn't laugh as much as she used to. He said she used to laugh at the cat. He said the cat hasn't changed, so something else must have. Reid was quiet for a long time. "He's 11, Mrs. Abernethy said. He misses nothing." She picked up the dish towel and went back to the sink. Reid sat at the kitchen table with his tea until it went cold. He walked to the cottage that evening after supper, not in the ATV, on foot down the orchard path in the long April dusk. The poplars along the fence line were fully leafed now. The light was the specific warm gold of Okanagan evening that Maeve had once described, in a letter he'd found in the cedar closet the winter after she died, as the light that makes me feel like we got away with something beautiful. He had read that letter sitting on the floor of the cedar closet at 2 a.m, and had not been able to stand up again for a very long time. He knocked on the cottage door. Josephine opened it. She was in her reading clothes, a loose flannel shirt, the kind of clothes a person wears when they have decided no one is coming. Her expression was careful and a little surprised. "Reid." She didn't call him Mr. Calloway. He noted this. "May I come in for a few minutes?" She stepped back. He came in. The kitchen was warm. There was something in the oven. Bread, he thought, from the smell. The three-legged cat was on the chair by the stove. A book was open on the table face down to hold the page. He stood in the middle of the kitchen and said nothing for a moment. He had rehearsed something in the orchard. He had rehearsed the correct, careful thing to say, the thing that acknowledged attention without naming it too plainly. He had stood beneath the poplars and composed 3 sentences. He had thrown them away by the time he reached the porch. "My son thinks you've stopped laughing," he said. She looked at him. He said the cat hasn't changed, so something else must have. Reid stopped. He said it the way a person says something they have not planned to say with quite that much plainness. He said it and didn't take it back. Josephine was very still. Then she said, "Owen notices things." "He does, he got that from his mother." She noticed everything. She used to say the world was just a long series of things most people had decided not to look at. Josephine sat down at the table. She didn't invite him to sit, but there was a chair and the kitchen was small and the invitation was in the air. He sat. "I heard the conversation," she said. "With her. With the woman who came." He didn't look away, "I know. I think I knew that night." She looked at her hands. I know what I am here. I know the position. I wasn't trying to. I know what you were trying to do," he said. "You were trying to help my son grow a tomato and remember his mother, and laugh at a cat with 3 legs. You were trying to do the job." He paused. "You were also, whether you meant to, giving me back something I'd stopped believing I was allowed to want." The bread in the oven made a small sound. The cat adjusted on the chair. Josephine looked up at him. He had the face, she thought, of a man who had been alone inside himself for so long that coming back to the surface was taking everything he had. "I've been very careful," he said, "for 11 years. I have been the kind of careful that looks like competence and is mostly just fear. I have been afraid of this house opening again. I have been afraid that if I let it open, it would mean something was over that I was not ready to have over." He looked at the window. The poplars in the last of the evening light. "I drove out to the fence line the day you and Owen were in the garden. I cut the engine, and I sat there and I watched my son sit down in the dirt in his good jeans and not care about the jeans." He swallowed. "I sat there for a long time, I know," Josephine said quietly. "I saw you there." He looked at her. "I didn't say anything," she said, "because it wasn't mine to say." He was quiet. The kitchen was warm. The light outside was going blue. "I'm not asking you to stay for the position," he said. "I'm asking you to stay because Owen is going to want to show you when the tomatoes come in, and because Mrs. Abernethy has decided you're the first person in 11 years who has been genuinely useful. And because," he stopped. He looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who had worked outside his whole adult life. and had recently been observed gripping a fence rail with the focused attention of a man learning to hold on. And because I would like to find out what happens if I stop being careful. Josephine looked at him for a long time, the kind of look that is not measuring exactly but is thorough, the kind of look that decides. The bread needs another 10 minutes, she said, and Mrs. Abernethy sent shortbread. She stood up and moved to the oven. She said it without theatre. She said it the way a woman says something practical, when the impractical thing has already been understood. He stayed for the bread. He stayed for the shortbread. He stayed, in the end, until Owen knocked on the cottage door at 8:30, saying he'd come to say goodnight to the cat, which everyone understood was not entirely about the cat. The three of them sat at the kitchen table with the last of the evening, and a plate of shortbread between them and the three-legged cat on the chair by the stove, and the tomato seedlings on the windowsill throwing small, pale shadows. And it was Mrs. Abernethy would say later to the man from the lumberyard who had the poor judgment to ask how things were at the Calloway place. It was the first time in 11 years the main house light stayed on past 10, because the man of the house was not in it. Marlena Stowe did not trouble them again. She had, by May, turned her attention toward a man in West Kelowna with a vineyard and fewer complications. She sent nothing. This was, Josephine thought, the dignified choice. What remained was the quiet and ordinary unfolding of a house that had been holding its breath for 11 years and had decided, in the particular mud and bud of an Okanagan spring, to breathe. Owen's tomatoes came in August. They came in red and crooked, and in quantities that surprised everyone. He brought the first one to Mrs. Abernethy on a Wednesday morning with both hands and set it on the kitchen counter without fanfare. Mrs. Abernethy looked at it for a long moment. She looked at Owen. She looked at the tomato again. She picked it up. She did not say anything for a bit. "That is exactly," she said, "the right shape." Owen nodded. "Seriously, I know." Josephine said so. Mrs. Abernethy put the tomato down and turned back to the counter and made a small sound that was not quite crying and was not quite not. Reid asked Josephine to marry him in September, on the cottage porch, in the early morning, in a way that was not dramatic and was not planned in the traditional sense. He had simply been sitting beside her with his coffee, watching the orchard in the first frost, and had turned and said, "I would like this to be the porch I sit on for the rest of my life, and I would like you to be the reason." She did not say yes immediately. She looked at him for a moment with the same thorough look she had given him in the kitchen in April. "Owen will want to be there," she said. "He will be there, Mrs. Abernethy will cry." "She is," Reid said, "very well practiced at crying." Josephine laughed. It was the laugh she had not been using these past weeks, the easy one, the one without management. It came out of her like something that had been waiting. "Then yes," she said. "Obviously yes. The wedding was small. It was at the property in October, in the orchard under the poplars, on a clear afternoon that was cool and bright in the way of Okanagan October." Owen stood beside his father in a tie he had tied himself imperfectly and had refused to have corrected. Mrs. Abernethy wore her good coat and cried at the right moments and several of the wrong ones. Biscuit, the three-legged cat, appeared uninvited on the periphery of the ceremony and was allowed to stay. The officiant was Josephine's Aunt Dorothy, 74 years old, who had driven up from Penticton in a car that had seen better decades, and who had the night before at the kitchen table in the main house looked at Reid Calloway over her reading glasses and said, "You took long enough." He had said, "I'm aware." She had poured him more tea and said, "Maeve would have liked this one." She fixed the cat, and she fixed the garden. Anybody who fixes both a cat and a garden at the same place is somebody who intends to stay. He hadn't known Aunt Dorothy knew Maeve. It turned out she had. It turned out a great many people had known Maeve, had loved her quietly in the background of years, and that this was one of the small ongoing mercies of a life lived in one place. That love, when it goes, does not entirely go. It only waits in the people around the edges until someone opens the door again. At the ceremony, Owen played the guitar. He was not accomplished. He had been learning for 4 months from a video series on his tablet, and what he played was recognizable and sincere and occasionally in the right key. He played the whole piece through. At the last verse he missed a chord badly, the kind of miss that would have made a child who had grown up differently wince and stop. Owen did not stop. He looked up at his father. He grinned. He played the wrong chord again, deliberately, with relish. Reid Calloway, who had not wept in 11 years, felt the thing that had been sitting in his chest since the morning they had told him, very gently, that Maeve was gone, felt it move. He felt it shift and ease, not all at once, not with the drama of something breaking, but with the particular mercy of something that had waited long enough and been given permission, finally, to set itself down. He did not cry, but it was close. It was the closest it had been in 11 years. Josephine, standing beside him under the poplars, reached over and put her hand in his. He held it. Aunt Dorothy, at her reading, looked between them once and looked back at her notes and said, quietly, to no one in particular, good. The orchard held them. The poplars moved. The afternoon light came down through the leaves in the particular way of October on the Okanagan bench, gold and clean and without apology. Mrs. Abernethy, in her good coat, stopped trying to manage herself and wept properly. The cat sat in the grass at the edge of the ceremony and cleaned its one good front paw with the focused dignity of an animal who has done its part. In the months that came after, the house opened itself room by room, the way houses do when the person inside them has decided without ceremony to live. The cedar closet at the end of the hall was finally emptied, and the photographs came out of the box, and Owen, on a November afternoon, arranged them along the windowsill of the music room, with a seriousness that was also joy. He did not ask permission. He understood by now that some things do not require permission, only the right moment and someone to stand beside you while you do them. The last photograph he set down was one from the hospital, his mother in a blue gown, his father at her shoulder, both of them looking not at the camera but at something just below the frame, at him, presumably, at the fact of him. He looked at it for a long time. Then he went downstairs, where Josephine was at the kitchen table with the seed catalogues for spring, and his father was at the counter making tea in the way he had recently learned to make it. Loose leaf in the old pot, the way Josephine's grandmother had done it. And he sat down at the table and said, I think we should do pole beans this year, along the south wall. Josephine looked up. She said, I think that's exactly right. And outside, the poplars stood along the north fence in the last of the November light. Bare now, their work for the season done, patient in the way of things that have been well planted, and know that spring is not a matter of if but only when.